The lone farmer lived far away from towns and trails, where the land stretched wide and empty under the open sky. His small wooden cabin stood on dry ground surrounded by tall grass, broken fences, and fields that barely survived the harsh weather. Every morning, he woke before sunrise, stepped outside with tired eyes, and looked across the silent land that was both his home and his prison. Life on the frontier was never easy, but he had chosen this path because solitude felt safer than people. He believed the land would never betray him, even if it tried to break him. The farmer was not old, but years of hard work had carved deep lines into his face. The sun had darkened his skin, and the wind had hardened his hands. He had once lived near a settlement, but trouble followed him there: arguments, broken trust, and loss. After that, he decided to live alone. Out here, no one asked questions, and no one demanded answers. His only companions were the creaking wind, the restless animals, and the distant howl of wolves at night. Each day followed the same routine. He repaired fences, watered weak crops, and checked his livestock. Sometimes he hunted small animals to survive, and other times he went hungry when luck failed him. Still, he endured. The frontier rewarded patience, not comfort. When storms came, he stayed inside his cabin and listened to thunder roll across the plains like the roar of an angry beast. When nights were quiet, the silence felt heavy, pressing against his chest. Though he avoided people, he was never free from fear. The Wild West was full of dangers: bandits, wild animals, and tribes that defended their land fiercely. The farmer had heard stories from travelers long ago, tales of sudden attacks and disappearances. He kept a rifle near his door and slept lightly, always listening. Fear was a tool here, as useful as any weapon. As evening approached, the farmer often sat on the steps of his cabin, watching the sun sink behind distant hills. The sky turned orange and red, and shadows grew long across the land. These moments were the only times he allowed himself to think about the past. He remembered laughter, voices, and warmth, things that felt strange now. But as darkness arrived, he pushed those thoughts away. Night demanded focus, not memories. That evening felt different, though he could not say why. The air was too still, and the birds had gone quiet earlier than usual. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The farmer stood slowly and scanned the land around him. His instincts told him something was wrong. Years on the frontier had sharpened his senses, and he trusted them more than reason. He stepped back inside his cabin, closing the door carefully. His rifle rested against the wall, and his lantern cast weak light across the room. The small space offered little comfort, but it was all he had. Outside, the sun had fully disappeared, and darkness claimed the land. The farmer sat on his chair, listening closely. Then he heard it, a soft sound, like footsteps brushing against dry grass. His heart began to pound. He told himself it could be an animal, but deep down, he knew better. Slowly, he stood and moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle. The frontier had taught him many lessons, but none prepared him for what was about to come. Whatever waited outside was not part of his routine, and the night had brought more than silence. The lone farmer took a breath, unaware that this moment marked the end of his old life and the beginning of a story that would be remembered long after he was gone. The farmer stood near the door of his cabin, listening carefully as the night settled around him. The sound he had heard came again, slow and steady, not rushed like an animal and not careless like a drunk traveler. It was controlled. He felt a tight knot form in his stomach. Out on the frontier, sounds after dark were rarely friendly. He lifted his lantern slightly, letting its weak light spill through the cracks of the wooden walls, but it showed nothing beyond the door. He waited, holding his breath. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost alive. Then, from the edge of the field, 3 dark shapes began to take form. They moved calmly, without fear, as if the land itself welcomed them. The farmer's heart pounded harder. He could tell they were human, but not settlers. Their tall figures and steady posture marked them as something else entirely. As they stepped closer, the farmer realized they were women, 3 Apache women, taller than any he had seen before. Their movements were quiet, their eyes sharp and alert. They wore simple clothing made for travel and survival, not decoration. Each step they took was firm, confident, and purposeful. They were not lost, and they were not afraid of him. The farmer felt a mix of fear and confusion. He had heard stories of Apache warriors, of swift attacks and sudden endings, but he had never imagined facing 3 women standing so boldly before his home. His rifle rested nearby, but his hand did not reach for it. Something about their presence told him that violence would only make things worse. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward slightly, her gaze fixed on him. Her expression was calm, almost curious, as if she were studying him the same way he studied the land before planting crops. The other 2 stood behind her, silent and watchful. None of them spoke at first. The night wind brushed past them, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass. The farmer swallowed and took a step back, keeping his movements slow. He did not want to appear threatening. In the Wild West, misunderstandings often ended in blood, and he knew better than to act without thought. He raised one hand slightly, a small sign that he meant no harm. His voice felt dry when he finally spoke, and even then, he said very little. The women did not react to his words. Instead, they exchanged brief looks with one another, as if sharing an unspoken agreement. Their silence was more unsettling than shouting would have been. The farmer's mind raced. Were they here for shelter? For supplies? Or for something else entirely? He had no way of knowing. The tallest woman stepped closer, stopping just outside the reach of the lantern's light. Her face was strong, shaped by the same sun and wind that had shaped his. There was no anger in her eyes, but there was authority. She belonged to this land in a way he never truly had, despite years of work and struggle. The farmer realized then how small his cabin was, how fragile his life seemed in that moment. He had built fences and walls, believing they could protect him, but now he understood that survival on the frontier depended on understanding as much as strength. These women were not intruders in his world, he was the stranger in theirs. The night grew deeper as they stood facing one another. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried out, breaking the tension for just a second. The farmer felt sweat on his palms despite the cool air. He wondered if this was the moment his luck would finally run out, or if fate had something else planned for him. At last, the tallest woman spoke. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying no fear and no hesitation. Though her words were simple, their meaning carried weight. The farmer listened carefully, knowing that what she said next would decide everything that followed. The frontier was about to test him in a way no storm, hunger, or loneliness ever had. 3 shadows had stepped into his life at dusk, and nothing would return to the way it was before. The words came calmly, without anger or softness, as if they were part of an old rule that did not need explanation. The tallest Apache woman stood firm in front of the cabin and spoke clearly so there would be no confusion. When the farmer heard her sentence, his breath caught in his chest. He understood the words, yet their meaning felt heavy and strange in his ears. He did not know if he should feel afraid, surprised, or relieved. Out here, on the frontier, words often carried more weight than weapons. The farmer looked at her face, searching for signs of danger or mockery, but he found none. Her expression was steady, serious, and sure. She was not asking him a question. She was stating something that, to her, was already decided. The 2 women behind her remained silent, their eyes alert, watching every small movement he made. The night air felt colder now, and the lantern light seemed weaker than before. His first thought was to refuse. The instinct to protect himself rose quickly, like it always did when the unknown stepped too close. He had lived alone for years to avoid exactly this kind of moment. People brought trouble. Decisions made in the dark often led to regret. But as quickly as the thought came, it faded. He knew better than to answer too fast. On the frontier, quick words could end lives. He asked himself what those words truly meant. The Apache woman did not step closer, did not raise her voice, and did not touch him. There was no threat in her posture. Instead, there was certainty. The farmer began to understand that this was not about desire or control, at least not in the way his fear first suggested. This was about something deeper, something tied to the land and its people. The woman spoke again, slowly this time, as if giving him space to listen properly. She explained that the night was dangerous, and that their path had brought them far from safe ground. To them, sharing shelter was not weakness. It was survival. It was a bond of protection, even if it lasted only until sunrise. The farmer listened, his thoughts shifting as her meaning became clearer. He felt his shoulders relax slightly. The fear did not disappear, but it changed shape. This was not a trap, but it was still a test. He understood now that refusing might be seen as disrespect, or worse, as hostility. Accepting, however, meant breaking the walls he had built around himself for years. Letting others into his space felt like opening an old wound. The farmer glanced back at his cabin. The small structure had protected him from storms, animals, and loneliness, but it had never faced a moment like this. Inside were his simple belongings, his food, his memories, and his quiet life. Allowing strangers inside felt like surrendering control, something the frontier rarely allowed. The Apache woman waited patiently. She did not rush him. Her confidence told him she was used to the land deciding things in its own time. The other two women stood ready, neither tense nor relaxed, simply aware. The farmer realized then that this moment was not about him alone. It was about understanding the balance of the frontier, where survival often depended on trust between unlikely people. Slowly he nodded. It was not a full agreement spoken aloud, but it was enough. The woman acknowledged his choice with a slight movement of her head. There was no smile, no sign of victory. Only acceptance. The tension in the air eased, but it did not disappear completely. The night still held its breath. The farmer stepped aside and opened the cabin door wider. The lantern light spilled outward, revealing the simple interior. As the women moved closer, he felt the weight of the moment settle deep inside him. He did not know what the night would bring, but he knew it would not be ordinary. On the frontier, survival often required courage that came in quiet forms. That night, the farmer learned that bravery was not always about standing alone. Sometimes, it was about opening the door when fate knocked without warning. The farmer stood aside as the three Apache women crossed the doorway of his cabin. Their steps were calm and respectful, not careless. They did not rush inside, nor did they touch anything without reason. This small detail surprised him. He had expected tension, maybe even force, but instead he felt something closer to order. The cabin, once silent and lonely, now held a quiet balance. The tallest woman spoke again, this time with a softer tone. She explained that what she had said outside was not a command made from power, but a rule shaped by survival. Among her people, the night was not taken lightly. Darkness belonged to danger, wild animals, enemies, and the cold itself. To face the night alone was considered foolish when shelter was near. To deny shelter was worse. The farmer listened closely. He had lived on the frontier long enough to understand that laws were different depending on where you stood. Settlers followed paper laws written far away. The Apache followed laws written by the land, passed down through generations. These rules were not debated, they were lived. The woman explained that sharing a roof for the night meant protection for all. No harm was allowed under that roof. No lies. No betrayal. The one who owned the shelter became responsible for those inside it until morning. In return, the guests offered respect and watchfulness. It was not weakness. It was trust built from necessity. The farmer felt something shift inside him as he heard this. He had spent years believing that isolation was the safest choice. He trusted walls more than people. Yet here were three women who survived not by hiding, but by understanding when to stand together. Their way of life felt strange, but it was not careless. It was careful in a different way. One of the other women added a few quiet words, explaining that the land remembered those who acted with honor. To the Apache, the land was not just ground beneath their feet. It was alive with memory. Those who respected its balance often survived longer than those who tried to control it. The farmer thought of his broken fences and failing crops. He had worked hard, yet the land had never fully accepted him. Perhaps he had been trying too hard to claim ownership instead of understanding where he stood. This thought made him uneasy, but also curious. As the night deepened, the women settled near the fire without being told. They did not crowd him or claim space that was not offered. Each movement was careful, practiced, and purposeful. The farmer realized that their strength was not loud. It was steady. He noticed that none of them showed fear of him. They remained alert, yes, but not afraid. That alone told him much. Fear was common on the frontier. Confidence was rare. These women carried confidence like a second skin, earned through experience, not pride. The tallest woman looked at him and said that by opening his door, he had accepted the law of the night. Until sunrise, they were bound by it. Whatever happened outside the cabin, they would face it together. At dawn, paths would separate without debt or regret. The farmer nodded again, slowly. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. This was no longer just his cabin. It was shared ground for one night. The idea felt heavy, but not wrong. For the first time in many years, he was not alone with his thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled. The sound no longer felt as threatening as it once did. The farmer realized that fear lost some of its power when shared. That night, the frontier taught him a quiet lesson. Laws did not always need ink and paper. Some were written in survival, passed through voices, and proven by time. And sometimes, the strongest law of all was simple: no one survives the night alone forever. Start with part 5, more unique 750 words. The fire burned low inside the cabin, sending soft shadows across the wooden walls. The farmer added a small piece of wood, careful not to make sudden movements. The 3 Apache women sat near the warmth, their faces calm, their eyes alert. No one spoke for a long moment. The night outside pressed close, filled with distant sounds that only the frontier could make. Inside, the air felt tight but steady, like a rope pulled firm. The farmer took his seat on the other side of the room. He could feel the change already. His cabin, once a place of quiet routine, now carried the weight of shared presence. Every sound felt louder, every movement more meaningful. He reminded himself of the rule the woman had explained. Under one roof, there would be no harm. He held on to that thought like a promise. One of the women stood and moved toward the door, checking the lock and the cracks in the wood. She did not ask permission, but she did not act carelessly either. Her actions were measured, done with purpose. The farmer realized she was taking responsibility, not control. She was guarding the space they shared. That understanding eased him more than he expected. Outside, the wind grew stronger. It pushed against the cabin as if testing it. The fire cracked softly, and the lantern flickered. The farmer listened, his senses sharp. He had spent many nights alone like this, listening for danger, but this night felt different. The fear was still there, but it was divided. He was not carrying it by himself. The tallest woman spoke quietly, telling a short story in simple words. It was about a night long ago when her people were caught in a storm with no shelter. Those who stayed together survived. Those who ran alone did not. Her voice was steady, not dramatic. She did not tell the story to impress him, only to explain why the law of the night mattered. The farmer listened without interrupting. He thought about the storms he had faced alone, holding his door shut, hoping the walls would be enough. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were not. He wondered how different those nights might have been if he had not pushed the world away. Time passed slowly. The fire grew smaller, and the women adjusted their positions to stay warm. No one slept deeply. Each person remained aware, listening to the land. At one point, a sound came from outside, footsteps or perhaps an animal moving through the grass. The farmer's hand moved toward his rifle, but one of the women gently shook her head. She listened longer, then relaxed. It was only a deer. The farmer lowered his hand, trusting her judgment. That small moment changed something between them. Trust did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces. The farmer began to understand that these women read the land the way he read the sky before a storm. Their knowledge was different, but just as real. The night stretched on. The cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the shared watchfulness. The farmer found himself thinking less about danger and more about the strange path that had led to this moment. He had chosen isolation to protect himself, yet tonight, protection came from togetherness. Near the middle of the night, the wind died down. The land grew quiet again. The women took turns resting, never all at once. The farmer did the same. He closed his eyes for short moments, waking easily, his mind calm but alert. He had not rested this way in years. As the hours passed, the tension faded into something steadier. Not comfort, exactly, but balance. The frontier had forced them under one roof, and under that roof, they had found a way to exist without fear or force. When the fire finally burned down to glowing embers, the farmer looked around the cabin. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been broken. Instead, something unseen had been added. Understanding, perhaps. Or respect. That night, the farmer learned that shelter was more than walls and a roof. It was a shared promise to face the darkness together. And under that small cabin roof, the night passed without blood, without anger, and without regret. The first light of dawn crept quietly through the cracks in the cabin walls. It did not arrive all at once, but slowly, like a careful visitor that did not wish to disturb the night's work. The farmer opened his eyes and listened. The land outside was waking up. Birds called softly, and the cold air carried the smell of morning. The long night had passed. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to ash. The Apache women were already awake. They moved with calm purpose, gathering their things without hurry. There was no sign of exhaustion on their faces, only readiness. The farmer noticed how naturally they greeted the morning, as if each dawn was a promise kept rather than a relief earned. The tallest woman stepped toward the door and opened it slowly. Sunlight filled the cabin, pushing away the shadows that had ruled the night. The farmer felt something lift inside him. Daylight had always been his comfort, but this morning felt different. It carried meaning. Outside, the land looked the same as it had the day before: dry grass, distant hills, an open sky. Yet the farmer knew he was not seeing it with the same eyes. The night had changed something he could not name. The fear that once lived quietly in his chest felt smaller now. The woman turned to him and spoke again. Her words were simple. She thanked him for honoring the law of the night. By doing so, he had shown respect not only to them, but to the land itself. Respect, she explained, was remembered longer than strength. The farmer nodded. He did not know how to answer in her way, so he spoke in his own. He said that he had learned something he did not expect. He had believed that survival meant standing alone, guarding what little he had. Now he understood that sometimes survival meant opening a door and trusting the moment. One of the other women smiled faintly at his words. It was brief, but real. The farmer realized then how rare such moments were on the frontier. Smiles did not come easily out here. They were earned. The women prepared to leave. There was no long goodbye, no exchange of promises. The law of the night ended with the sunrise. That was the way it was meant to be. Paths crossed when needed and separated when the time came. Before stepping away, the tallest woman paused. She looked at the farmer once more, her eyes steady. She told him that the land watched those who lived upon it. Those who learned its ways survived longer than those who fought it. Then she turned and joined the others. The farmer stood at the doorway as they walked away, their figures moving confidently across the open ground. They did not look back. They did not need to. Their presence faded into the land as naturally as it had arrived. When they were gone, the farmer remained still for a long moment. The morning sun warmed his face, and the quiet felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of thought. He returned inside the cabin and looked around. Everything was the same, yet nothing felt unchanged. The space seemed larger, lighter. The walls no longer felt like barriers, but shelter. As he stepped outside to begin his daily work, he noticed the land more carefully. The direction of the wind. The patterns in the grass. The way the sun touched the hills. He felt more aware, more connected. That night had taught him something the frontier had tried to teach for years. Strength did not always mean distance. Wisdom did not always mean silence. And understanding did not always come from books or laws written far away. Sometimes, understanding arrived quietly, under a shared roof, in the company of strangers. And when the sun rose, it stayed behind, shaping the days that followed. The farmer took a deep breath and began his work, carrying the lesson of dawn with him into the open land. The days that followed felt familiar on the surface, yet deeply different beneath. The farmer rose before sunrise as he always had, stepped outside, and looked across his land. The fields were the same, the fences still broken in places, and the work waiting had not lessened. But something inside him had shifted. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt thoughtful. He went about his routine with steady hands. He fed the animals, checked the soil, and repaired a section of fence that had fallen during the last storm. As he worked, his mind returned again and again to the night that had passed. Not in fear, but in reflection. He replayed the moments, the calm voices, the shared silence, the way trust had formed without promises. Before that night, he had believed the frontier demanded hardness above all else. He had trained himself not to expect help, not to rely on anyone. People brought loss, he thought. Distance brought safety. Yet the land had quietly proven him wrong. Safety had come not from isolation, but from understanding. As the sun climbed higher, he paused and wiped sweat from his brow. He noticed things he had ignored before. The way the wind bent the grass in patterns. The tracks of animals near the edge of his field. Signs that life moved all around him, even when he stood alone. The land was not empty. It was full, if one knew how to look. In the following weeks, travelers passed near his land. Once he might have watched them from a distance, ready to hide or defend. This time, he stood openly by his fence. He did not invite them in, but he did not retreat either. A simple nod replaced suspicion. To his surprise, that was often enough. At night, he still locked his door, but he slept differently now. His rest came easier. The sounds of the frontier no longer felt like warnings alone. They felt like conversations, messages carried by wind and earth. He listened, not with fear, but with respect. The farmer began to understand that the Apache woman had not only spoken a law of the night. She had shown him a way of living. The frontier was not meant to be conquered or shut out. It was meant to be shared carefully, moment by moment. One evening, as he sat on his cabin steps watching the sky change color, he felt something he had not felt in years: peace without loneliness. He did not wish for company, but he no longer feared it. The difference was small, but powerful. He thought about how stories were born on the frontier. Not from grand battles or loud victories, but from quiet nights and simple choices. Most stories were never written down. They lived in memory, passed from voice to voice. Perhaps this night would become one of those stories, shaped differently each time it was told. As seasons changed, the farmer's life slowly improved. His crops grew stronger. His animals stayed healthier. It was not magic, and it was not luck. He paid closer attention. He learned to work with the land instead of forcing it. The lesson of that dawn stayed with him. Sometimes, he wondered about the three women. He did not expect to see them again, and he did not need to. Their presence had already done its work. They had crossed his path to remind him of something he had forgotten: that survival was not just about endurance, but about awareness and respect. The farmer was still alone, but he was no longer closed. The frontier remained dangerous, but it no longer felt hostile. He had learned that strength could be quiet, and courage could look like an open door. And so, the man who once believed solitude was his only shield continued his life on the land, changed, grounded, and ready for whatever the Wild West chose to bring next.